In a town bound by greed, one woman's rebellion sparks a flame that could burn an empire, or her heart. The dawn broke over Iron Hollow, Nevada, in 1883, a jagged scar of light tearing through the charcoal sky. The air was heavy with the tang of sagebrush and the faint, acrid bite of coal smoke drifting from the silver mines that clawed the canyon's heart. Belrose Carter, 18, stood on the sagging porch of her family's weathered cabin, her boots, scuffing boards worn smooth by years of despair. Her auburn hair, woven into a tight braid with a crimson ribbon, glowed like embers in the rising sun, and her brown eyes, deep and unyielding as desert stone, traced the ridge trail where hope had long since withered. She wore a gray gingham dress, its yellow stripes faded to whispers, the hem patched from endless labor. A copper pendant etched with her mother's initials hung at her throat, a tether to a woman buried 3 winters ago, when fever stole her hymns and left Belrose to carry the weight alone. Iron Hollow was no place for dreams. It was a town forged in greed, its wooden storefronts and crooked saloons bowing under the shadow of Baron Waverly's silver empire. The mines fed his wealth, and his wealth fed the town's fear. Every banker, preacher, and drunk owed him their breath. Belrose's father, once a farmer with calloused pride, now slurred his days away in Waverly's saloon, his debts piling like stones on a grave. A week ago, he'd staggered home, eyes glassy, and pressed a crisp parchment into her hands, a marriage contract, her name scrawled in ink, binding her to Waverly to clear his tab. "It's the law, girl," he'd mumbled, collapsing into a chair. Belrose had torn the paper, her voice a blade. "I'm not his to buy." He'd wept, but the law, dressed in a sheriff's badge and a clean hat, cared only for Waverly's word. Now, as Belrose swept dust that clung like a curse, her pendant warm against her skin, she felt the earth shift beneath her. Hooves thudded on the canyon trail, heavy and deliberate, not the lazy trot of a miner's mule. She paused, broom still, her pulse a hammer in her chest. 3 riders emerged from the sagebrush haze, their black coats flapping like carrion birds, led by Hollis, Waverly's foreman. His gaunt frame seemed carved from bone, his eyes pale and sour as curdled milk, a coiled rope dangling from his saddle. He dismounted, spurs jangling like chains, and tipped his hat with a smirk. "Morning, Miss Carter. Baron's riding in today. Wants his bride cleaned up and ready." Belrose's fingers tightened on the broom, her voice low, forged in fire. "I'm no man's bride, Hollis, not his, not yours." Hollis stepped onto the porch, his boots creaking, the rope swaying in his hand. "You'll learn to kneel, girl, or we'll break you like a colt." The other riders chuckled, their horses snorting, but Belrose didn't flinch. Her brown eyes locked on his, a storm brewing in their depths. The street stirred. Mrs. Connolly peered from her bakery. A miner paused his cart, the saloon's batwing. Doors creaked. No one spoke. Iron Hollow knew Waverly's wrath. His silver owned their tongues, their homes, their spines. Belrose stood alone, her shadow sharp against the cabin's splintered wall, the pendant a quiet pulse against her heart. She thought of her mother's last words, whispered through fever. "Hold your fire, child, till it burns true. Get off my land," Belrose said, her voice cutting the air like flint. Hollis's smirk twisted, his hand raising the rope, but a sharp clatter broke the moment. A horse's snort, a saddle's groan, echoing from the canyon's rim. The riders turned, hands on revolvers, as dust curled like smoke on the trail. Belrose's breath caught, her eyes narrowing. It wasn't Waverly's men, not yet. Something else was coming, something Iron Hollow hadn't braced for. And as the hoofbeats grew louder, a stranger's shadow loomed, carrying a spark that could set her world ablaze. The sun climbed higher over Iron Hollow, Nevada, its heat pressing down like a judgment on the dusty streets. Belrose Carter stood rigid on her cabin's splintered porch, the broom now a makeshift staff in her calloused hands, her gray gingham dress with faded yellow stripes catching the breeze. Her auburn braid, secured with a crimson ribbon, shimmered like molten copper, and her brown eyes, deep as desert stone, burned with a defiance that hadn't dimmed. The copper pendant at her throat pulsed with the memory of her mother's strength. a quiet hymn against the chaos. Hollis, Waverly's gaunt foreman, loomed before her, his pale eyes glinting like spoiled milk, the coiled rope in his hand swaying like a noose. His two riders flanked him, their revolvers glinting under black coats, horses snorting impatiently. "You'll be Waverly's by dusk, girl," Hollis sneered, stepping closer, his spurs scraping the boards. "Ain't no choice in Iron Hollow." Belrose's jaw tightened, her voice a low growl. "I'd rather burn than bend." The words hung heavy, a challenge that made Hollis's smirk falter. The street was a graveyard of courage. Mrs. Connolly ducked behind her bakery counter. A miner averted his eyes. The saloon's piano fell silent. Waverly's silver owned their souls, and Belrose was a spark they couldn't afford to catch. Hollis raised the rope, its fibers rough as his intent. But the canyon's echo carried a new sound. Hooves, steady and unhurried, cutting through the sagebrush haze. The riders turned, hands on guns, as a lone figure emerged from the dust. Colt McCrae rode into Iron Hollow on a bay stallion, its coat gleaming like polished mahogany, a stark contrast to the town's faded bones. He was 35, tall and lean, with a face carved by sun and sorrow, high cheekbones, a jaw dusted with stubble, and gray-green eyes that held secrets like a locked chest. His chestnut hair, short and tousled, peeked from under a weathered black Stetson and a long duster coat. The color of storm clouds billowed over a navy flannel shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows. A leather belt held a Colt revolver, its grip worn smooth and a faint scar curved above his left brow. A ghost of battles past. He dismounted with a grace that belied his weight, tying the stallion to a hitching post outside the general store. Whispers trailed him. "McCrae? Thought he was dead. Lost his herd to raiders, they say." He ignored them, his gaze sweeping the street, until it landed on Belrose. Her eyes met his, not pleading but piercing, a silent dare to look away. Colt didn't. For a moment the world narrowed to that exchange, her fire meeting his steel. He stepped into the store, bought a sack of coffee and a tin of biscuits, his movements deliberate, unhurried. Emerging, he paused by the saloon's shadow, setting a tin mug of water on a barrel near Belrose's porch, just out of Hollis's sight. The gesture was small, almost invisible, but Belrose's throat tightened, her cracked lips aching for relief. She didn't move, not yet, her pride a wall as high as the canyon cliffs. Colt's step faltered as he passed, his gray-green eyes flicking to her pendant, then away, as if it stirred a memory he'd buried deep. Hollis spat in the dust, oblivious, his rope snapping taut. "Enough stalling, girl. Waverly's comin', with a preacher and a ring. You'll wear silk or you'll wear bruises." Belrose's fingers twitched, the broom creaking under her grip. "Touch me," she said, her voice ablade, "and you'll bleed first." The riders laughed, but Hollis's eyes narrowed, his hand inching toward his revolver. The air thickened, taut as a bowstring, the town holding its breath. From the saloon's edge, Colt watched, his hand resting lightly on his gun, his shadow long and still. He hadn't meant to linger in Iron Hollow. Coffee and a new trail were all he'd sought. But something in Belrose's stance, unbowed under the weight of a town's cowardice, anchored him like a stone. Mrs. Connolly whispered to her husband, "She's just a girl." He hissed, "Waverly'll burn us all." No one else spoke, but their silence was a chain, binding. Belrose tighter than any rope. She thought of her mother's grave, marked by a single sagebrush sprig, and her father's slurred apologies, drowning in whiskey. The pendant burned against her chest, a vow to fight. Hollis took another step, the rope raised high, but a sharp crack echoed from the canyon. A wagon wheel or something heavier, rolling closer. The promise of Waverly's arrival hung like smoke, and as the dust curled thicker, Colt's quiet act of defiance lit a spark that could either save Belrose or doom them both. Noon scorched Iron Hollow, Nevada, 1883. The sun a relentless hammer forging the dusty streets into a crucible of fear and silence. Belrose Carter stood defiant on her cabin's splintered porch, her gray gingham dress with faded yellow stripes, clinging to her sweat-dampened skin, auburn braid blazing like a torch under a crimson ribbon, her brown eyes deep as desert stone locked onto Hollis, Waverly's gaunt foreman whose pale, curdled milk gaze promised cruelty. The rope in his hand snapped taut, a thread as old as the canyon scars, while his two riders, black coats, flapping gripped revolvers, their horses pawing the red earth. "Time's up, girl," Hollis growled, his spurs glinting like fangs. "Waverly's here to claim you." Belrose's fingers curled around the broom, her voice a spark in dry tinder. "He'll claim nothing but dust." The street was a graveyard of courage. Mrs. Connolly's bakery shutters slammed shut. A miner's cart rattled away. The saloon's piano choked on a sour note. Iron Hollow's pulse belonged to Baron Waverly, his silver mind strangling hope from every soul. Belrose's copper pendant burned against her chest, her mother's voice echoing, "Hold your fire, child, till it burns true." She stood alone, her shadow ablaze against the cabin's weathered planks until a tin mug of water, left by a stranger, gleamed on a barrel nearby. A quiet defiance she hadn't dared touch. Hollis stepped closer, rope raised, but the air shifted. A low rumble like thunder caged in stone rolled from the canyon trail. Hooves thundered, not one horse but many, and Waverly's procession crested the ridge. The Baron himself led, a man of 50, broad and unyielding, his silver hair swept back like a crown, eyes black as coal seams under a tailored black frock coat. A gold watch chain glinted at his vest, a revolver with an ivory grip holstered at his hip. Behind him a preacher rode in a creaking buggy, clutching a Bible, and 3 riders carried white silk, a wedding dress, pristine and mocking. Waverly dismounted, his boots stirring dust like a king's decree. "Miss Carter," he said, voice smooth as venom, "you'll look radiant in silk." Belrose's lip curled. "I'd rather wear rags than your chains." Hollis lunged, rope swinging, but a sharp crack split the air. A whip snap, precise and deadly. The rope fell, severed, coiling in the dust like a slain snake. Colt McCrae stepped from the saloon's shadow, a bullwhip coiled in one hand, his bay stallion tethered nearby, mahogany coat gleaming. He was 35, lean and weathered, chestnut hair tousled under a black Stetson, gray-green eyes sharp as flint. His storm-gray duster billowed over a navy flannel shirt, a scar above his left, brow catching the light. His Colt revolver hung low, grip worn, a silent vow. "Step back, Hollis," Colt said, voice low, steady as iron. "She ain't yours to touch." The crowd gasped, a ripple of whispers breaking the silence. "McCrae," a miner muttered, "heard he lost everything to raiders." Hollis froze, his hand hovering near his gun, but Waverly's laugh cut through, cold and deliberate. "A drifter playing hero," he said, stepping forward, gold watch ticking like a clock on Belrose's fate. "You're meddling in my town, McCrae. She's mine by law." Belrose's eyes flicked to Colt, not pleading but searching, her pendant a pulse of courage. "The law's your leash," she spat at Waverly. "It don't own me." Colt's gaze held hers, a flicker of something raw, grief, resolve, or both, before he faced Waverly. "Law don't make right," he said, whip still in hand. Waverly's eyes narrowed, his riders tensing, revolvers half drawn. The preacher coughed, clutching his Bible tighter, his face pale as the silk dress swaying on the wagon. Mrs. Connolly peered from her window, whispering, "God help her." No one else moved, their fear a heavier chain than iron. Belrose's heart roared, her mother's words aflame in her veins. She dropped the broom, stepping off the porch, her boots crunching dust, standing shoulder to shoulder with Colt. "You want me, Waverly?" she said, voice ringing. "Come take me yourself." Hollis snarled, lunging again, but Colt's whip cracked, grazing his arm, drawing blood. The foreman staggered, cursing, and the riders drew their guns. The air was a taut wire ready to snap, Iron Hollow teetering on the edge of blood. Colt's hand rested on his revolver, his scar a map of battles fought and lost. Belrose felt the weight of his presence, not a savior, but a spark, kindling her own fire. From the canyon, a distant clatter grew louder, more hooves, or something, heavier, promising Waverly's wrath was far from spent. And as the dust swirled, Belrose and Colt stood together, their defiance a flame that could either free her or burn Iron Hollow to ash. Dusk draped Iron Hollow, Nevada, 1883 in a shroud of amber and ash, the canyon cliffs swallowing the last light like a secret. Belrose Carter slipped through the town's shadowed alleys, her gray gingham dress with faded yellow stripes snagging on splintered fences, auburn braid swaying beneath a crimson ribbon. Her brown eyes, deep as desert stone, scanned the darkening trail, her copper pendant a steady pulse against her chest. The tin mug of water, left by the stranger Colt McCrae, had quenched her thirst but kindled something fiercer, a resolve to outrun the chains of Baron Waverly's claim. Her boots, scuffed and worn, whispered against the red earth as she moved, the memory of her mother's voice a beacon. Hold your fire, child, till it burns true. Iron Hollow's silence was a cage, its streets empty save for the saloons, drunken laughter in the preacher's buggy, abandoned with its mocking white silk. Colt McCrae waited at the canyon's edge, his bay stallion pawing the ground, its mahogany coat blending with the twilight. He stood 35, lean and carved by hardship, chestnut hair tousled under a black Stetson, gray-green eyes sharp as a hawk's. His storm-gray duster hung over a navy flannel shirt, a scar above his left brow etched like a forgotten vow. His Colt, revolver rested low, a bullwhip coiled at his belt, its leather worn from use. He'd cut Hollis's rope with a single crack, buying Belrose time, but time was a currency Iron Hollow didn't spare. "You're late," he said, voice low, steady, as bedrock as Belrose emerged from the shadows. She handed him the tin mug, now empty, her fingers brushing his. "Didn't want to owe you," she replied, her tone flint-sharp but warm, like a fire banked but alive. They moved without words, Colt leading her to a narrow trail winding through sagebrush and jagged rock. The stallion trailed, reins loose, while Belrose kept pace, her limp slight from a bruised ankle but unyielding. She didn't ask for help and he didn't offer pity. Only a canteen, passed in silence, which she took with a nod. The canyon was a labyrinth, its walls etched with the ghosts of miners who died for Waverly's silver. Colt's eyes scanned the ridges, his scar catching the fading light. "They'll come for you," he said, not looking at her. "Waverly don't lose." Belrose's pendant glinted as she walked, her voice steady. "He's lost me already." Colt's gaze flicked to her, a flicker of respect or something softer crossing his weathered face. They reached a dry creek bed, its stones bleached like bones under a half-moon. Colt crouched, checking tracks, his fingers tracing hoofprints not yet dusted over. "Hollis and his dogs ain't far," he murmured. Belrose knelt beside him, her braid falling over one shoulder, studying the marks. "You don't have to do this," she said, her brown eyes searching his. "You don't know me." Colt's jaw tightened, his voice rough as gravel. "Knew someone like you once. Didn't help her in time." He stood, brushing dust from his hands, the scar above his brow a map of regret. Belrose didn't press, but her pendant felt heavier, her mother's strength urging her to trust, not him, but herself. A distant shout pierced the night, followed by the clatter of hooves. Waverly's men, their torches flickering like vengeful stars on the ridge. Hollis's voice carried, raw with fury. "Find her, or the Baron'll have our hides." Belrose's heart pounded, but her hands were steady, curling around a stone as if it were a weapon. Colt untied the stallion, his movements swift, precise. "There's a miner's shack half a mile west," he said, nodding toward a shadowed gully. "It'll hold till dawn." Belrose met his gaze, her voice a quiet blade. "And then?" He didn't answer, but his gray-green eyes held hers, a silent pact forged in the dust. They ran, the canyon swallowing their footsteps, sagebrush tearing at Belrose's dress, her pendant bouncing against her chest. The shack loomed ahead, a crumbling relic of wood and tin, half buried in the cliff's embrace. Colt kicked the door open, dust swirling like ghosts, and Belrose followed, her breath ragged but unbroken. Inside, the air was thick with mold and memory, a rusted lantern, flickering on a warped table. Colt barred the door, his whip coiled like a promise, while Belrose stood by a cracked window watching torchlight dance closer. Iron Hollow's chains were long, and Waverly's wrath was a fire of its own, and as the hoofbeats thundered nearer, Belrose and Colt braced for a fight, their shared spark threatening to blaze into something neither could control. Moonlight carved Iron Hollow's canyon into sharp edges, the miner's shack a crumbling sentinel against the cliff's shadowed embrace. Inside, the air was thick with mold and tension, a rusted lantern casting jagged flickers across Belrose Carter's face. She knelt by a cracked window, her gray gingham dress with faded yellow stripes torn at the hem, auburn braid loose beneath a crimson ribbon. Her brown eyes, deep as desert stone, tracked torchlight weaving through the sagebrush, her copper pendant, glinting like a talisman. Colt McCrae crouched beside a warped table, his bay stallion tethered outside, its mahogany coat blending with the night. At 35, his chestnut hair was damp under a black Stetson, gray-green eyes sharp as a blade, a scar above his left brow stark in the lantern's glow. His storm-gray duster hung open, navy flannel shirt stained with dust, Colt revolver steady and one hand bullwhip coiled at his belt. Hooves thundered closer, a chorus of wrath led by Baron Waverly, his voice slicing the darkness like a blade. "McCrae, you're hiding my property." Belrose's fingers tightened on a borrowed revolver, her voice a low burn. "I'm no one's property." Colt's gaze met hers, a flicker of pride in his gray-green eyes, but his jaw was set, haunted by a past failure he wouldn't name. "Stay low," he said, checking the shack's barred door. "They'll try the windows first." Belrose nodded, her pendant warm against her chest, her mother's words a steady flame. "Hold your fire, child, till it burns true." The first rider appeared, torch raised, his black coat flapping like a vulture's wings. Hollis, Waverly's gaunt foreman, followed, his curdled milk eyes glinting, a rifle in hand. 4 more shadows fanned out, their spurs jangling like death knells. Waverly dismounted last, a broad figure of 50, silver hair gleaming under a tailored, black frock coat, eyes black as coal seams, ivory-gripped revolver gleaming. "Send her out, McCrae," he barked, gold watch chain ticking like a countdown, "or we burn you both." Colt stood, kicking the door open, his whip uncoiling. "She's free," he said, voice steady as granite. "You got no claim." Belrose stepped beside him, revolver raised, her braids swaying like a pendulum. "You bought my father's debt, Waverly," she said, her voice ringing through the canyon. "Not my soul." Waverly's laugh was cold, a predator's sneer. "You're a girl with a drunk's name, nothing more." Hollis raised his rifle, but Belrose fired first, the bullet splintering wood near his shoulder, a warning that drew blood from his cheek. Chaos erupted. Gunfire cracked, sparks flying off the shack's tin roof. Colt's whip lashed out, disarming a rider, his revolver barking twice, dropping another to the dirt, blood staining the sagebrush. Belrose ducked a bullet, her next shot grazing Hollis's arm, forcing him behind a boulder. The shack shuddered, a torch crashing through the window, flames licking the dry wood. Colt yanked Belrose down, shielding her from glass, his scar vivid in the firelight. "Stay with me," he said, his voice rough but fierce, a vow beyond the fight. She nodded, reloading with shaking hands, her brown eyes blazing. They moved, as one, Colt firing through the door, Belrose covering the window, their rhythm a dance of survival. Another rider fell, clutching his thigh, and the fourth fled, his horse vanishing into the canyon's maw. Waverly roared, firing wildly, his frock coat torn, silver hair wild. "You'll pay, McCrae," he shouted, but his men were breaking. Hollis lunged from the shadows, knife gleaming, aiming for Belrose. Colt's whip cracked, wrapping his wrist, yanking him to the ground. Belrose pressed her revolver to Hollis's chest, her voice ice. "Run, or you're done." He scrambled back, cursing, and fled with Waverly, their torches fading like dying stars. The shack burned, flames curling up the walls, but Belrose and Colt stumbled out, coughing, the stallion rearing in panic. They collapsed in the creek bed, Belrose's pendant glinting, Colt's hand brushing hers, not romantic but raw, a shared pulse of survival. Waverly's retreat echoed through the canyon, a promise of vengeance unbroken. Belrose's breath was ragged, her dress singed, but her eyes were steady, her mother's fire alive. Colt reloaded his revolver, his scar a testament to battles lost, but his gaze on Belrose was new. Hope, not regret. The shack crumbled, embers drifting like fireflies, and Iron Hollow's chains felt lighter, if only for a moment. But as dawn loomed, Waverly's wrath simmered and the canyon whispered of a reckoning neither could escape. Dawn broke over Iron Hollow, Nevada, 1883, painting the canyon in hues of gold and rust, the smoldering ruins of the miner's shack a testament to a night of fire and defiance. Belrose Carter sat on a flat stone by the dry creek bed, her gray, gingham dress with faded yellow stripes singed at the edges, auburn braid frayed but held by a crimson ribbon. Her brown eyes, deep as desert stone, traced the horizon where sagebrush met sky, her copper pendant catching the first light like a quiet vow. The air was cool, scented with pine and ash, and the silence was no longer a cage but a canvas, vast and unclaimed. Colt McCrae leaned against a twisted juniper, his bay stallion grazing nearby, its mahogany coat dusted with canyon red. At 35, his chestnut hair was tousled under a black Stetson, gray-green eyes softened by the dawn, a scar above his left brow a faint echo of old wounds. His storm gray duster was torn, navy flannel shirt stained, but his Colt revolver rested easy, the bullwhip coiled at his belt now still. The battle's echoes lingered. Waverly's retreat, Hollis's curses, the shack's collapse. But Iron Hollow felt distant, its chains broken in the dust. Belrose's wrists, bruised from the struggle, were healing, her fingers tracing the pendant, her mother's voice a steady hymn. Hold your fire, child, till it burns true. She glanced at Colt, his silhouette sharp against the rising sun, and spoke, her voice soft but sure. I thought freedom would feel louder. He met her gaze, a faint smile tugging his lips. It's quiet 'cause it's yours. She nodded, the weight of her father's betrayal, Waverly's claim, and Iron Hollow's silence lifting like morning mist. Colt tossed a pebble into the creek bed, his gray-green eyes distant as if seeing a ghost. Lost someone once, he said, voice rough as gravel. Tried to save her, but I was too late. Raiders took her, and I buried her under a sky like this. Belrose's pendant grew warm, her heart a drum. You think I'm her second chance? She asked, not accusing but curious. Colt shook his head, his scar catching the light. You're your own. I'm just here to see it through. Her lips curved, not a smile but a spark, and she stood, brushing dust from her dress, her boots steady on the earth. They walked to a ridge overlooking the canyon, the stallion trailing, its reins loose. Belrose's limp was gone, her strength a fire no chain could douse. I was Belrose Carter, she said, pausing, her brown eyes fierce. Now I'm just Belrose. No debts, no names I didn't choose. Colt tipped his Stetson, his voice low. Belrose suits you. She laughed, a sound like wind through sagebrush, and the canyon seemed to listen. They sat by a small fire, sharing coffee from Colt's dented tin mug, the silence between them alive, not empty. Her hand brushed his as she passed the mug, a touch not romantic but honest, forged in shared scars. North, Colt said, nodding to the horizon. There's land up there, clean water, no barrens. Belrose met his gaze, her pendant glinting. And you? He shrugged, a rare warmth in his eyes. I go where you do. They packed the camp, Belrose tying a blanket to the stallion's saddle, Colt checking his revolver. The canyon was still, but Waverly's shadow lingered, a debt unpaid. Belrose didn't look back at Iron Hollow, her mother's grave, her father's ruin, but forward, where the sky was wide and hers. Colt walked beside her, their shoulders close, not lovers but allies, Their fire line burned through by choice, not chance. Historical note. In the 1880s American West, women like Belrose faced systemic oppression through forced marriages and debt bondage, yet many carved paths to agency, reshaping frontier communities. Explore their stories in Nevada's mining towns to understand their resilience. Like if this tale of defiance moved you. Subscribe and hit the bell for more frontier epics. Comment. Would you ride north with Belrose and Colt? And as they stepped toward the horizon, the canyon sang of a flame that no empire could extinguish.